There are men whose deaths leave a gap so wide that the people standing around it cannot see the other side. Phil Robertson was one of those men. When the Robertson family gathered in the days following his passing on May 25th, 2025, they were not simply mourning a father or grandfather. They were standing at the edge of an era that had quietly closed behind them. The bearded patriarch from the swamps of Louisiana, the man who built an empire out of handmade duck calls, unshakable faith, and refusal to apologize for who he was, had taken his final breath at the age of 79. And what he left behind was far more powerful than any dollar amount could measure. The grief hit immediately. His son, Jace Robertson, was the first to share the news publicly, writing simply, "My dad has gone to be with the Lord today." Those words, plain and direct, exactly the way Phil himself would have said them, landed on millions of people at once. Fans who had followed Duck Dynasty since its 2012 premiere on A&E, conservatives who had seen Phil as a cultural warrior, and ordinary families who had simply found something honest and warm in the Robertson household all stopped whatever they were doing and felt the weight of what had been lost. But for the Robertson family, the grief was something far more intimate and complicated, because Phil hadn't just left behind memories. He had left behind a carefully considered legacy, arranged with intention, shaped by decades of hard living, hard faith, and hard-earned wisdom. And when that legacy was finally laid out before them, every detail of it, it brought them to tears in a way the funeral itself had not. To understand what Phil Robertson left behind, you have to understand where he started. He was born on April 24th, 1946, in Vivian, Louisiana, the fifth of 7 children. His family had no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and no safety net of any kind. Meals depended on what the land could provide. Phil grew up learning to hunt not as a sport, but as a survival skill. The swamps and bayous of northern Louisiana were not a backdrop to his childhood. They were the classroom where he was educated in the things that mattered most to him for the rest of his life. Patience, discipline, self-reliance, and respect for creation. He was gifted in ways that surprised people. His athletic talent earned him a football scholarship to Louisiana Tech University, where he became the starting quarterback, ahead of a backup named Terry Bradshaw, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated quarterbacks in NFL history. The recruiters came calling. The professional future was right there, waiting for him to take it. Phil said no. He chose the Ducks. He chose the swamps. He chose a life built on his own terms rather than someone else's ambitions. That decision, strange as it seemed to outsiders, was the first true expression of the man Phil would spend his entire life becoming. He didn't chase fame. He didn't chase money. He chased meaning. And meaning, for Phil Robertson, was always found outdoors, within family and within his faith. In the early 1970s, he invented a duck call that more accurately mimicked the sounds ducks actually made. He called the company Duck Commander, and he built it from scratch in a shed, carving calls by hand and shipping orders one at a time. Miss Kay, his wife of 60 years, the woman he had met in high school and married when she was just 17 years old, stood beside him through every lean year, every setback, every morning when the bank account said one thing and the faith said another. It was not a smooth road. Phil's own accounts have never shied away from the darker chapters of his younger years. The drinking, the temper, the times he was not the husband or father his family needed. But then came the turning point that he spoke about for the rest of his life. At the age of 28, Phil Robertson walked into a small church in West Monroe, Louisiana, broken and searching, and walked out changed. His conversion to Christianity was total and permanent. He rebuilt his marriage. He reconciled with his children. He turned all of the intensity that had once destroyed things toward building something that would last. That faith, raw, unpolished, deeply personal, became the engine of everything Duck Commander would eventually become. For decades, Duck Commander grew steadily. Willie Robertson, Phil's son, returned from college with a vision to modernize the business and take it national. Together, the two generations built something that no one in West Monroe could have predicted. When Duck Dynasty premiered on A&E in 2012, it was supposed to be a modest reality show about a quirky Louisiana family that made duck calls. Instead, it became one of the most watched cable programs in television history. At its peak, more than 11 million viewers tuned in every week. The Robertson family became household names overnight. Duck Commander merchandise flooded retail stores. Phil's image, the long beard, the camouflage, the Bible, became one of the most recognized in American popular culture. His estimated net worth at the time of his death stood at approximately $10 million. Built from Duck Commander. Book royalties from titles like Happy, 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 and Unpiltered. Speaking engagements across conservative and Christian circuits. And his podcast Unashamed, which he co-hosted with Jace, and which drew millions of listeners who connected with his blunt, scripture-anchored way of seeing the world. But Phil's version of success never looked like anyone else's. He and Miss K continued to live modestly on their Louisiana property. He didn't buy mansions or exotic cars. He hunted in the same woods he had hunted as a boy. The fortune he built was real, but it was always secondary, a byproduct of doing what he loved and saying what he believed. Phil's public life was not without controversy. In 2013, comments he made in an interview sparked a national firestorm that led NE to briefly suspend him from the show. He refused to walk anything back. Conservatives rallied around him. The suspension lasted weeks before the network reversed course. Whether you agree with Phil Robertson or not, it was impossible to deny that he was exactly who he claimed to be, a man governed by conviction, not by popularity. In December 2024, the Robertson family went public with news that Phil had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Fans who had watched Phil in action for over a decade found it difficult to reconcile the image of that towering, certain man with the reality of a degenerative illness quietly taking pieces of him away. Inside the family home, the reality was harder than anything the public saw. The decline was faster than expected. By April of 2025, Jace confirmed on the Unashamed podcast that Phil was not doing well and that the family was focused on keeping him comfortable. Yet even as his body weakened and his memory fractured, something in Phil remained steady. His voice, when he recorded his final podcast episodes, sounded remarkably like the Phil his audience had always known, grounded, unhurried, and at peace. He had spoken about death for years, not with dread, but with the calm certainty of a man who genuinely believed in what came next. He had told his children to dance when he died, not to weep. He believed with everything he had that death was simply a doorway. On May 25, 2025, Phil Robertson passed away at home, surrounded by his family. He was 79 years old. The moment was quiet. The weight of it was immense. His daughter-in-law, Corey Robertson, shared a statement that captured the tone of what the family wanted the world to know. We celebrate today that our father, husband, and grandfather, Phil Robertson, is now with the Lord. They quoted the same scripture Phil had quoted to them for years, the words of Paul about grieving with hope rather than without it. The private funeral that followed was held exactly as Phil would have wanted. No press, no cameras, no politicians attaching themselves to the moment for the sake of appearances. Just family, close friends, and a gathering anchored in prayer, laughter, and the kind of silence that only comes from a life fully shared. It was after the funeral, in the days that followed, that the full weight of Phil's legacy settled onto his family. The practical matter of what he had built and what he chose to leave behind carried an emotional meaning that no one had fully prepared for. Miss K, who had stood beside Phil for 6 decades, through poverty, through his conversion, through the swamps and the studios and the controversies, was his first and deepest priority. Her health had also been declining, and after Phil's death, those who loved her watched closely as she navigated grief while managing her own battle with dementia. Willie later said publicly that she took Phil's death harder than perhaps anyone had anticipated. That losing her partner nearly 60 years created a grief that went beyond sadness into something physical, something that touched her health in ways visible to everyone around her. The Duck Commander business, the company that started as a hand-carved duck call in a Louisiana shed, continued forward under Willie's leadership, just as Phil had always intended. Willie, who had been central to transforming Duck Commander from a regional business into a national brand, carried the weight of that responsibility with the seriousness his father would have demanded. And a revival of Duck Dynasty on A&E, which premiered just days after Phil's death, went forward as planned. The first season of Duck Dynasty, the revival became, in part, a tribute to a man who had made all of it possible. Season 2 continued to honor his presence, with Corey Robertson noting that Phil's influence remained woven into every episode, even in his absence. That is a big part of why we wanted to do the show, she explained, just to show the next generation and the legacy continuing. But the tears came not from the assets and not from the business arrangements. They came from a realization of what Phil Robertson had actually been building all along. Not a company, not a television show, not even a fortune. He had been building a family, one that knew where it came from, what it believed, and how to carry itself when the man who taught them everything was no longer in the room. Phil Robertson grew up without electricity or a toilet in his home. He chose duck hunting over NFL recruiters. He rebuilt his marriage from the wreckage of his own worst years. He carved duck calls and shed and turned them into a cultural empire. He said what he believed on national television and refused to take it back. He recorded podcast episodes in the final months of his life, his voice steady even as his mind was being taken from him. When a man like that leaves a fortune to his family, the money is the smallest part of it. The part that makes him cry is everything else. The letters written in a shaking hand, the faith that outlasted the fame, the example of a life lived without apology and without compromise. Phil Robertson did not leave his family rich. He left them equipped. And for the Robertson family, standing at the edge of that gap in May of 2025, that was the most overwhelming inheritance of all. What part of Phil Robertson's story stays with you the most? Share your thoughts below. And if you want more stories about the lives that shaped American culture, subscribe. The next chapter is always worth knowing.